Good morning, everybody. I'm back. So today we're going to do lesson 5, which is the construction of this little dress. Before we actually do the construction, I'm going to go over a couple things that I mentioned briefly in the previous video. So first of all, once you get your fronts and backs together, we're going to grade the seam allowances like I talked about. And that is because we don't want, let me do this side, it looks a little bit better. We don't want the bulk of having like that big ridge where all these layers end together, because that's a lot of fabric. There's your pleating, 2 layers of fabric from your piping, and another layer of fabric from your bodice. So you can see why we didn't want the interfacing as well in the seam allowance. Okay, so what you do when you grade a seam is the part of the seam allowance that's closest to the outside is the longest, and the part that's on the inside is the shortest. So you trim your seam allowance to, somewhere around 1/8 or 3/16, and then you trim your piping seam allowance to a little bit higher than that, and then lastly your bodice seam allowance to a little higher than that. So now you have this stepped seam allowance, and it doesn't leave that big ridge like we had previously. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think I talked briefly about removing the piping cord from your seam allowances. And I've already done that on my little dress, except for this one, so I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, if you've got some cord sticking out, good for you. But if you don't, what I do is I take these little tweezers and I pull the cord out the length of the. Let me get you up close. Hold on. I pull the seam allowance out. It doesn't want to focus very well. 1/4 to 3/8. Either your seam allowance or a smidge more, and just clip it off. All right, and then come back and kind of pull that like that, and then you can feel that you don't have that bulk in the seam allowance. Because remember now, when this is all put together, that's going to turn back on this that's already pretty bulky, right? So it's good to reduce any bulk that you can. Okay. So I've gone ahead and done a couple of steps on this, and I'll tell you about them, but it was just way too boring for you to have to watch. So I have seamed up my side seams, and I did my little French hem, like we talked about. French hem. French seam finish. Why can't I think of what that is? Anyway, crazy. You do not have to do this. If you have trouble doing this, or your machine makes it wonky for some reason, you can just do 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, do a little zigzag in the seam allowance, and trim it off and be done. I do not always do a French seam. That's what it is, French seam. If I am, just making an everyday little play shirt or something, I don't always do this. You can also serge the seam if you want. I'm not very good friends with my serger, and I don't like a lot of things serged, but this is a place that certainly would be acceptable to serge if you would like to. Okay, so that's number 1. I did that on my side seams, and then I took my lining pieces and I joined them. I'm going to go back out to a 1 here. I joined them at the underarm, okay, and then I went around and did a machine stitched hem on the bottom. All right, mine is about 1/4 of an inch. I'm just trying to adjust this light a little. It's about 1/4 of an inch. You can do less. I would not do more. Okay, so you just do that all the way around the bottom. This lining is going to hang loose on the inside of the dress, but it will cover your smocking. So then the next thing we have to do is just put the lining onto the dress, like so. We're going to pin it. I usually try to pin so that I'm not going to hit any pins. Remember back in the day you were taught that if you went over pins with your sewing machine perpendicular, that would be fine. Well, it's not fine. Sewing machines have come a long way. They're pretty much all computerized now, and you need to take those pins out. You could totally mess up the timing on your machine if you do that, if you happen to hit a pin. Plus it's dangerous because number one, you can bend your pins, and number two, you can break them and pieces can go flying, which is dangerous. As a matter of fact, I have a friend that when she teaches kids to sew, she makes them wear safety glasses. So we're just going to pin this all the way around. You might need to make a little adjustment when you actually go to sew it, but it's pretty simple. And then I always pin at the underarm, and they should match up nicely, and they do. Oh, the other thing is I certainly do not do a French seam on little short places like this that are going to be hidden on the inside of the dress anyway. I don't do them on shoulder seams, and I rarely do them in places like this or the seam of a sleeve when you put the sleeve edges together, because it's just bulky. And I had a couple of kids that were very I know there's a word for it, but sensitive to how things felt. As a matter of fact, they used to call the top button of a shirt or a top the choke button, and they'd always be like, "Don't button the choke button, don't button the choke button." They were funny. Anyway, or the seam of a sock. So now you're just going to pick where you're going to start, and you are going to stitch all the way around this little dress with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can just pick where you're going to start. I'll just start here. Well, I don't want to start there. I'll start at an underarm and just go around. I do about nothing bigger than a size than a 2 length. Okay, I gotta take that. I kind of did this backwards, but that's okay. A 2 length on my sewing machine stitch. Try to get this in so you can see it a little bit better. Hold on. I'm afraid it's gonna go, my hands and the dress are gonna be in the way, but I'll do the best that I can here. Where am I? Okay. Okay. I don't have a lot of storage on my phone. I'll get back to that in a second. I just want to tell you, when you get to this corner and you're going to pivot, needle down and pivot, but I usually do one little stitch on the diagonal and then turn. You'll still have just as sharp as of a corner, but it'll make it a little easier to turn. It's probably not important that you do that. It's just what I do. Okay. I think I'm going to get a standing tripod so that I can stand the tripod beside me rather than having it on the table all the time. But at any rate, what I was going to say earlier is I've tried to manage the storage on my iPhone, and I have to some degree, but I still don't seem to have a lot of storage. So if this goes, if this cuts off, don't worry, I'll just continue it in another video. But I think we should be able to get this done. Coming up to the other armhole here. So I think this is going to be our last video, except I might put a video on in a little while just to kind of show you what the corrections are on the blouse pattern if you want to make it. So you can watch for that. But one thing I can't really help you with is your buttonholes, and I know that's kind of a bugger for everybody, or for a lot of people, but I can't really help you with that because every machine is different. And what I would advise you to do, get your manual out and practice. Practice on similar fabric. I always do a practice buttonhole before I do my actual garment, just to make sure there's no you know, problems, because taking out a buttonhole is not fun. Okay, we're getting there. Whoops, that went too far. I don't want that. I want that. Okay. Oh no, we're not getting to the armhole. We're just on the back neckline. So really the only thing to do after this is to trim your seam allowances, and I usually trim to, you know, like an 1/8 or a 1/16 of an inch. And it is important to use that smaller stitch length. I know a lot of people are used to sewing at a 2.5. I rarely sew at anything more than a 2, and sometimes I sew at a 1.8, and if I'm doing a little curve on a collar or something, I might even do a 1.4 to a 1.6. Oops. I have an automatic, you know, a button to raise and lower my presser foot, but it also can be done manually, and I always forget which one I've done, and my machine likes to tell me that I did it wrong. This machine also, you can get a foot pedal that, depending on where you step on it, raises and lowers your presser foot and cut your thread, and I don't have that. I just find the way it is automated enough for me. Okay, we did it. We went all the way around. Okay, I'm going to go back out here. So now all there is left to do is, number one, take my pins out. I think that's it. So now you can see we've stitched all the way around. This is the front, this is the back, and I'm going to go back now and trim those seams, clip them, and then turn it right side out and press it. Before I do that, I'm going to take this to the ironing board, and I am just going to press it the way it is. So remember I told you about melding the stitches? I find that that's important both in garment construction and in quilting. So I have a little mantra that I like to teach my students, and it's press the way you sew, then press the way you want it to go. Okay, so you're going to press everything flat, and then when you go to turn it and press it the way you want it to go, you'll have a sharper crease. I also want to tell you about these little tweezers. They're not necessary, but they're a great little tool for the sewing room. They are called Uncle Bill's tweezers. I think they cost about $7, and they're on Amazon, but they are super for grabbing something small that you need to grab, like when we were doing the there we go, when we were pulling the piping out of the seam allowances. Okay, see how small they are? You can use probably any tweezers, but these are particularly good because they're real pointy. What else? You saw my little blouse, I think, that's peach. So now I have a decision to make about my buttons, and I haven't made it yet. But I have two. I have these buttons that are very sweet. They have a little etching on them. They're just La Mode buttons that are peach. And I also have these. And we'll talk about buttonholes in a second. They're just little fisheye ones that are also pale peach. So I have to decide that. Normally, and if I ever teach you a class that has a back button dress, there is some very strict rules that require you to choose your button before you even cut your fabric out. But in this case, it's not as necessary. But I will tell you this, if you are trying to figure out how long to make your buttonhole needs to be the width of your button. Let me hold this up, this one up. Take it off here. This still has the little metal thing on it, but you'll see what I mean. So it needs to be the diameter of your button plus the thickness of your button. Okay? And a lot of buttons are an 1/8 inch. So, but all you have to do is wherever your button, when you're trying to figure out your length, lay your button down, make a mark, okay? Then you got this here, and then, whoops, and then you tip it up to get the width, and then make another mark there. So it's the diameter of the button plus the thickness of the button, okay? Now I'll show you on my machine. I can do I can do my buttonholes lots of ways. I can do them manually, but I have this automatic buttonhole attachment that you put the button, oops, excuse me, it goes this way. You put the button into the back here, and then, whoops, I just dropped it. Put the button in the back, close it, and then you put it on your machine. And once you've I play a little bit with the width of the stitch and the length of the zigzag and everything. But once you have all that set and you stitch with this, it automatically makes the right size buttonhole for your button. And I use that a lot. Now if I did manual buttonholes on my machine, they're a little bit nicer, but not anything that anyone would notice unless you get out your magnifying glass. So I do use this a lot. But and I can do corded buttonholes with this too, which maybe I'll teach you sometime, because you hit your cording on here, and corded buttonholes are beautiful on something like corduroy, where your stitches sink into the fabric and you don't want them to, so the cording raises it up a little. Anyway, so I can't help you with your buttonholes. I could if we were in person, but can't do that right now. What else? I think that's about it. Let me just check my list. Okay, yeah, that's about it. I will when I finish this, I'll send you a static picture so that you can, see it well. And then in a few days, I'll probably do that little tutorial about the blouse and what you need to change on that pattern that comes with this dress. All right. So thanks, guys, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.